Welcome to another episode of the Bible Toolbox. I'm Lydia.
And I'm Luke, and we are here to help you enjoy the Bible through tools that scholars and programmers have created for you. And we have another special guest with us, Dr. Mark Strauss, who is a university professor of New Testament at Bethel Seminary. He's written many books and articles.
So many books.
I first learned about him from his Introduction to the Four Gospels, Four Portraits, One Jesus. And what's probably most relevant for us today is his co-written book with Gordon Fee on how to choose a translation for all it's worth.
Which we reference in our episode 3 of Bible translations.
Yep. So, welcome,
yes.
Mark.
Thank you so much for being here.
Great to be here, Luke and Lydia. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And, I guess another significant reason Mark is on is because he is the vice chair of the NIV translation. And you started on the committee in 2005, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. When were you put on as vice chair?
Oh, yeah. I don't know. About 3 or 4 years after that, I think.
Oh, okay.
I was surprised. They elected me, and I said, why would you possibly elect a newbie here?
Impressive.
Yeah. So we're just going to ask you questions here about your experiences on the NIV.
Is the NIV committee still like a thing? Is it still going?
Yeah, it's one of the few committees, the Bible translation committees, that meets perpetually. It's met since the 1960s when the NIV was being produced. It's a committee of 15 people. CBT stands for Committee on Bible Translation. And it's a constant engagement with the text. Every year we meet, usually for a week, but sometimes, like this last year, we met for 2 weeks because we're behind in proposals. Proposals for better translation come in from all different quarters, from scholars, from pastors, from lay people. And we examine these. A committee member needs to give them a second to bring them to the floor. Everyone is prepared ahead of time, so they've read these proposals, and then we discuss them and ultimately vote on them. In order to pass, our philosophy is if it's not broke, don't fix it. And so in order to pass and get into the text, it takes a supermajority of 70% of the committee to get in. So once it's passed, it has reached a very high threshold in terms of the certainty of the text, in terms that it will be an improvement. Most proposals either relate to more accurate English or better English, or something related to the accuracy and precision of the text. Those are really the two things we focus on the most, is better English so that it's clearer, or that it's more accurate to what the meaning of the original text. Sometimes there'll be a scholarly conclusion that scholars are coming to a particular consensus that a particular word means this instead of maybe the way it's been traditionally translated. So those are some of the kinds of things that we introduce.
Very cool. So how does that differ from your prior experience on the translation? Because was there an NIV translation before you were on the committee?
Oh, yes. Yeah. In fact, the 84 translation was the last revision before the 2011. So that was the standard. And we don't change the text every year. The text is only changed when a new edition comes out. And it's Biblica, who owns the copyright to the NIV, used to be the International Bible Society. Before that, the New York Bible Society. They're the ones who sponsored the entire project of the NIV. And so they hold the copyright, and they decide when the new edition will come out. So 84 was the standard NIV most people knew until the 2011. And when the next one comes out will be determined by Biblica. But probably every 25 or 30 years is when new editions come out. Yeah.
And what's your role in that process?
As a committee, you mean, or
like you personally?
As an individual. Well, I'm on the committee, and so every year we bring proposals, we consider them, we vote on them. They are incorporated into the text, our text, if you will, the present NIV, which will then become the standard NIV when the next edition comes out. And in fact, this is the way all Bible translations are. If you open any Bible translation and look at its copyright, there'll be several dates. There'll be date when it was first produced, there'll be a date when it was revised, and date in its latest revision. So those dates indicate when new editions come out. So the NIV is no different than others in that regard. It's probably different in that the committee always meets every year. some of these other translations, the committee will disband and then they'll come back together for a few years and then put out a new edition. For the NIV, we're constantly meeting every year.
Yeah.
There's just so many proposals to consider and things to look at.
Cool.
Okay. Well, before we jump in too further, can you just explain what is the NIV's translation philosophy? Just as a reminder.
Sure, yeah. And that's a great question because it's called different things by different people, of course. And there's no doubt that it is heavily influenced by what is called dynamic equivalence or functional equivalence, which is the perspective that really what you're trying to translate is not the words of the text, the form of the text in terms of the Greek or Hebrew form, which take very different forms than English terms, but rather the essential meaning of the text. You're trying to communicate as much of the meaning as possible. So formal equivalence or literal translation tries to reproduce the form. Functional equivalence or dynamic equivalence seeks to reproduce the meaning. Now we can talk about more as to what's the better philosophy and why. But in fact, the NIV is very much a mediating translation between these two. Sometimes those on the formal equivalence call it a functional. Those on the functional equivalence call it too literal. It's interesting. I've worked with a lot of international Bible translators. I've learned so much from them. They're just brilliant in terms of linguistics, understanding how language works, understanding how to communicate in diverse cultures. So I've worked with them a lot. And a lot of them consider the NIV to be way too literal. They would never be that literal in their international translation because they're so focused on communicating the meaning. Then you talk to these Bible scholars who live in the Hebrew and Greek, and they say, oh, it's too much paraphrase. It's too functional equivalent, too dynamic. When in fact, it really is very much in the middle of the spectrum between those more formal equivalent and those more functional equivalent. And I think that was the reason for its enormous success. The NIV is the only translation that has ever passed up the King James Version in sales. About 20 years ago, it passed it up, and it's always then been the leading English translation. And I think the reason for that is because it's still, for us traditionalists, it still sounds like the real Bible. It still sounds like the King James Version because it very much keeps the language and cadence of our traditional translations. At the same time, it's clear and understandable. And so people would read and they'd go, oh, this is the King James Version, but this time I understand it. I get it, actually. And that was a huge breakthrough. And that together with the fact that it was produced by a diverse group of evangelicals from kind of across the evangelical spectrum, so it was popular with all different denominations and so forth, plus the fact that it sounded like the real Bible, but it was so much more clear. I think that's what really skyrocketed the NIV to its success. That's sort of that middle of the road. It wasn't a paraphrase. It wasn't too easy that it didn't sound very biblical. It wasn't too difficult that people couldn't understand what it was saying.
That's so cool. Very neat.
Yeah. So let's talk about how did you get asked to be a translator? What was that whole process like?
Yeah, that kind of came about in the context of controversy. Some of your listeners will be old enough to remember what's sometimes called the Stealth Bible controversy or the NIV Inclusive Language Edition controversy. It was back in 1997, and I had been writing actually a little bit on this topic before this. I was teaching a class on Philippians, a Greek exegesis class on Philippians. And I was very much into linguistics and language, how it works. And so I would teach my students that words get their meaning from their context. They have a semantic range, a range of possible meanings, but it's the context that determines the meaning. A student asked me in that class, if that's the case, why does the Greek word adelphoi in Philippians get translated by the NIV as brothers when it clearly means siblings? It clearly means brothers and sisters in these contexts. And I said, don't you think that brothers sounds inclusive of men and women? And everyone in the class said, no, it doesn't. So I started thinking about this and I thought, that's interesting. We translate that wrong. It should be brothers and sisters to be more accurate to the Greek, what the Greek actually means, or siblings. I don't think we'd say dear siblings. That sounds so sterile. But it means brothers and sisters. So I wrote this rather naive article called Gender Bias in Bible Translation, encouraging people to adopt what the words actually mean instead of this traditional masculine terms, to use a more inclusive term, because that's what the Greek actually means in context. Well, I've been writing about this a little bit when suddenly this controversy exploded on the scene related to the NIV. There was an NIV produced in Great Britain that was gender inclusive. The Brits were way ahead of us. They were demanding more gender inclusive language. It was just sounded so wrong to have man, 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 man when it was person, when it was people, and brothers when it was clearly brothers and sisters. They were thinking we were mistranslating the text because it was clearly inclusive in context. And so they said, we want a gender inclusive NIV. Well, so Zondervan produced one for them. Biblica produced one for them. It became known as the NIVI, the NIV Inclusive Language Edition, and it was published in Great Britain. Well, World Magazine got a hold of this, and they wrote this big expose article called the Stealth Bible Controversy. And on the cover of World Magazine was a stealth fighter, a picture of a stealth fighter. And the article is basically about egalitarianism or feminism in the church, as they called it, and the danger of this. But they attacked the NIV as going gender neutral. And this just blew up into a huge controversy because, the issue of feminism in the church and the challenges that people have seen in that whole movement, the egalitarians versus complementarians. And this became a huge controversy, so much so that the NIV people, the Biblica, the International Bible Society, backed off and they said, okay, we're going to freeze the NIV at this point. They realized very quickly that was impossible to do because the mandate for the NIV demanded that it be updated to keep up with English language. Mm-hmm. So they couldn't freeze it. So what they did instead is they launched the TNIV, Today's New International Version. And that was the subject of incredible attack from the right wing. They sought to destroy this. There were whole websites developed to attack today's NIV. Zondervan and Biblica tried to promote the TNIV for about 10 years. During those 10 years, there was more and more controversy related to it. Very few people adopted it because it was so controversial. Finally, Zondervan and Biblica decided it was time to cancel the TNIV and go back to incrementally revising the NIV the way they should have done from the beginning. So they made, and I would say they made two major mistakes. The first was freezing the NIV, which they should never have done. The second was launching a competitor, the TNIV, which they never should have done. Now, in hindsight is 2020, of course. Right. So ultimately, then they went back and said, okay, we're going to look at every gender reference in the whole Bible, and we're going to do a new NIV that will try to, as accurately as possible, reproduce the gender as it appears in the Bible. And that became then the 2011 NIV. So somewhere in the middle of that, after the TNIV was produced, but before the NIV 2011 came out, I was invited to join the committee. That would be 2005. I think the TNIV came out in 2001. So I had been supporting them in writing, and I had been debating some of those who were attacking these gender inclusive translations. And I wasn't doing it from any perspective on egalitarianism or patriarchy or hierarchy or complementarianism or whatever. I was just doing it for linguistically. What they were saying about the text was wrong. They were saying things like, well, the Greek says man. Well, the Greek doesn't say man. The Greek says anthropos, and anthropos means person, human being, like anthropology, right? It means person. It doesn't mean man. And so I was approaching this from the perspective of linguistics and language, how language functions. And so they asked me to join the NIV committee because of my work in translation and in linguistics. That was a very long answer to a short question.
On that same topic, can you just talk about the study that the NIV went through to make that decision to go gender inclusive? Well, yeah, to go gender inclusive, that was almost a no-brainer, really, because the English language has changed dramatically. And in fact, the 84 NIV really sounds male-oriented in areas where it shouldn't, where it's clear it's referring to men and women. It says man, 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 quite a lot. So I think they had to revise it. Every translation, here's what's funny, is every translation, even those that are produced by those who oppose this language, have adopted gender inclusive language. The ESV, which was produced by people mostly in opposition to the NIV, the ESV changed the word man to person or something else over 500 times from the RSV, which was, it's a revision of the Revised Standard Version, and it changed it over 500 times. So all of the versions were incrementally doing this. The problem was when the NIV did it, the NIV is at the top of the heap. The NIV is the standard evangelical Bible. That's when
you can see all hell broke loose basically when it did that and went in that direction. Did I answer your question? What was your question?
What can you talk about the like computer and statistic analytics?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's right. Sorry about that. Before doing the 2011 NIV, Zondervan commissioned the Collins Dictionary Group to look at the state of gender language in the country and in the world in English, basically. They wanted to, because we didn't want to get out ahead of the language. We didn't want to impose anything on the language. We wanted basically to communicate the way people actually spoke and taught. So this was a massive study of English literature, basically contemporary English literature, magazines, journals, books, these kinds of things, because we wanted to know how people were actually speaking, where English was. And that then became the guide. It didn't determine every instance, but it became the general guide by which we would make decisions based on gender. And the 2011 was a compromised translation in many ways. We stuck with some of them. In some of the more controversial passages, we stuck with some of the masculine language, even though many on the committee felt like the passage was inclusive. It was referring to men and women. If it was possibly male focused, then we would tend to err on the side of caution in those kinds of passages. So I would say they sort of moved backwards a little bit from the TNIV, even though I would argue there was nothing wrong with the TNIV. It was justifiable in every single one of its translations related to gender.
Yeah. I just think I thought that was so interesting when I learned that, of just the amount of English study that went into just making the decisions.
Yeah, that was a massive study. It's still available around. I think Zondervan probably has, you can find it online, that Collins study, but it indicated a number of things that were significant in terms of the way, and if you look at the NIV 2011, you can see it's meant to be the way people speak in terms of gender language today.
So in terms of like word for word versus thought for thought, formal versus functional, because I can see like with word for word, it's like, well, these are the words and these are their meanings, so we're going to put this word in. But how do you balance not being too interpretive, but also staying true to the text?
Sure. Well, a literal or word for word translation has a tendency to do two things. They want to try to use the same English word whenever a particular Greek or Hebrew word is used. So they try to stay with the same word if possible. The problem with that is words have many meanings. They have a semantic range. They don't have a literal meaning. If you ever hear someone say the literal meaning of this Greek word is, about 90% of the time, what follows is actually wrong. Words don't have literal meanings. They have a range of potential senses. In one presentation, I have a slide where I show the New American Standard's translation of the word logos. And, you might ask, what's the literal meaning of the word logos? And most people would say word. But in fact, the NASB, one of the most literal translations available, translates the word logos like 20 different ways. Words like statement, thing, question, reply. There's a whole range of ways in which it translates it, showing you that even that one word has dozens of different meanings. So the key is to translate a word, its meaning in context, not to always try to use the same word every time. If you try to use the same word all the time, you're going to mistranslate much of the time. The other thing a literal translation tries to do is they try to stay with the grammar and syntax of the Greek or Hebrew. But English grammar is dramatically different than Greek and Hebrew grammar. And in the real world, to be honest, nobody translates literally. If you were in the United Nations and there was someone speaking from the front and they were simultaneously translating into 100 languages, which happens every day, I can guarantee you not a single one of those translators would be translating word for word or literally. Because if they were, they'd be fired on the spot because they'd be translating terribly. To translate literally is really to translate poorly because no two languages line up like that. One example I always used when I was doing these lectures and debates was this. I live in San Diego, so the Spanish phrase, como se llama, standard Spanish phrase. Well, what does that phrase mean? Well, most people would say it means, what's your name? But if you take it literally, it means how yourself called. Como se llama. How is como, it's a question word. Se is a reflexive pronoun, yourself, and llama is a verb, call. How yourself call. So that's a literal translation. How yourself call. But no one would ever translate it like that. Sometimes I say, you could smooth it out a little and say, how do you call yourself? How do you call yourself? And I
But no one
jokingly
says
say
that.
that's an NASB translation. It's how do you call yourself, basically, because they just smooth it out enough until you can barely get it. You understand it, but it's not the way we would normally say it in English. The way we would say it in English is, what's your name? What's your name? That's what we would say in English. And you've completely messed up the grammar, right? Instead of a question word como, you've got the question word what. Instead of a reflexive pronoun say, you've got the verb to be is, what is. Instead of a verb, yama, you've got a noun, what's your name, with a possessive pronoun in front of it. You've changed every bit of the grammar. You've changed every form of the grammar, but you've communicated one thing. You've communicated the meaning of it in English, in normal English. And that's what translation is. It's communicating the meaning of the text, not the form. If the form communicates the meaning well, that's fine. Stay with the form. If the form doesn't, then you need to change the form in order to reproduce the meaning. And if you think about it, every translation actually follows that procedure, because even a literal translation is going to stay literal until what? Until it's not clear or understandable. Then they're going to change the form. So they always default to changing the form in order to reproduce the meaning. So ultimately, they're operating with a philosophy of meaning-based, even though the formal method they use is trying to stay literal. So what we ask is, what does the text mean? What does this phrase mean? How do we best communicate that meaning in English? If you need 5 words to communicate one word in Greek, but it communicates the meaning, that's the best possible translation. So the idea of formally following word for word, following the grammar, is just a fallacious method of translation. Martin Luther, when he translated the Bible into German, into colloquial German from the Greek and Hebrew, he made a number of statements about this. He says you can't possibly follow the Greek or Hebrew. You have to follow the meaning of the text. How Germans would say it, he says, in his writings. So that's he was exactly right, that we need to follow the meaning of the text, communicate it as accurately as possible to what the Greek and Hebrew meant, not necessarily the form of the Greek and Hebrew.
Yeah. So you've already alluded to, you guys disagree on the committee at times. So, and you talked about the 70% majority. Can you talk more about how do you handle those times personally? And do you have any good examples or?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, it certainly takes a bit of humility. And what is amazing to me is the chemistry on the NIV committee. And it's been this way for the entire time I've been there. We've heard stories about maybe it wasn't always that way, but you've got some incredible biblical scholars. You know about Doug Moo. Doug Moo is the chair of the committee. Bruce Waltke has been on the committee for a long, long time. One of the leading Old Testament scholars in the world. Every name of person on the committee is just an incredible biblical scholar. Pretty much half Old Testament, half New Testament. And so obviously there's some ego here. These people have written the commentaries. And yet it's amazing to see, they'll come and present a proposal. And it might be Bruce Waltke presenting a proposal. And he's just written this massive commentary on the book. He knows what it means, and he'll argue for his position, and others will respond. And then we'll vote on it. And you'll see he'll get voted down. All of us get voted down. And you think, oh my goodness, this is going to shatter the committee. And it's just like, nope, move on to the next one. Okay, let's go. Let's move on to the next one. So I just marvel at the humility of these men and women, to see how they passionately believe in getting it right, but they also recognize that this is not a committee of 1, it's a committee of 15. And everyone has input to give, positive input to give, and we do the best we can. And we realize that this is a devotional task, not just an academic one. This is God's word we're seeking to reproduce and to make clear and to make accurate. We start every day when we meet together with a devotional. One of us brings a devotional. And we really do consider this to be a sacred task, to get God's word right, because the vast majority of people are going to read the Bible not in its original languages, but in translation. So it's critically important for us to seek to get the translation as accurate and as readable as possible.
That's so assuring to hear, as someone who can't read Greek or Hebrew, that you hold it so specially in your hand.
Absolutely.
Divine task.
And you can trust your English versions, all of them. I mean, all of these we've been talking about are really good Bible translations. And you mentioned early on, but using more than one is always a good idea. I would strongly encourage you to use more than one, because no translation is perfect by any means. And something is always lost in the translation. sometimes it bothers me when I hear someone promoting their translation. They're basically saying this is the only one you should use. Well, I would never say that about the NIV. You should use the NIV, but you should also use other versions across the spectrum, from the more idiomatic translations to the more formal or literal translations.
So how do you advise somebody who is looking for a translation? I mean, saying use more than one is still a bit vague.
It is. And if they want to talk about individual ones, I'll tell them which ones I would favor. And I've worked on translations across the translation spectrum, but I would say certainly choose one in the middle, at least, maybe two in the middle, at least one on the more functional side, the more idiomatic side. The best-selling functional equivalent version in English is the New Living Translation. Then I would encourage them to use one on the more formal equivalent side. And I think the most formal equivalent is the New American Standard Bible. So they really follow their methodology more closely than the other more literal versions. Some of the other more literal versions may be more idiomatic, so they're not being quite as literal. They're not being consistent, in other words, in terms of following the procedure that they claim, their method that they claim to be following. So that would be a good one. I really like the NRSV on that side as well, because those translators, a lot of really good scholars on the New Revised Standard Version. In terms of scholarship, and I'm biased, of course, I'm on the NIV committee, I'm biased, but I would say in terms of scholarship, from the functional equivalents, the NLT committee, the New Living Translation Committee, if you read their translators, they're like a who's who in biblical scholarship. If you read the NRSV translators, it's the same. They are like a who's who in biblical scholarship. So, and then the NIV, I would argue, is the same as well. So those would be three really good ones to use. The NASB, like I said, a very good one. The ESV, a very good one. It's a revision of the RSV, which itself was done by very good scholars as well. So any of those translations will do very well. The New Christian Standard Bible is really far superior to its predecessor, the Holman Christian Standard Bible. And they've done a really good job with that. That's another mediating translation. So that's a direct competitor to the NIV. But I would say I wrote a review on the Christian Standard Bible, very favorable review, because it's very well done as well. So, and we could go through the New English translation, the Net Bible, excellent translation. All of these translations are really well done. All of them have as their goal to accurately reproduce God's word in a way that is clear, accurate, and readable.
Well, we got a lot of work to do. We got a lot of Bibles to read.
Yeah, that's right. My colleague used to read, he was on the NIV committee, but he would read through a different version every single year, a different version all the way through from Genesis to Revelation every year. So I thought that's a great practice.
Yeah, that's a great practice.
Yeah. So which translation do you use?
Oh. I preach from the NIV. I really do think it's the best translation because of its mediating role. It's in the middle. It's done by extraordinary scholars from the beginning. It's in the middle, which I think captures a lot of the nuance, things like word plays and verbal allusions. It captures those kinds of things, but it's also clear and readable. So, but as I said, I'm biased. I've been on the committee. I've seen the work that's gone into it. I've seen those, the quality of the scholars who produced it. So I preach from that, but then I'll refer to others, and certainly in my writings, I'll cite various versions. If I think another version has done better, I'll cite that and point that out. And I do that. I do that in my writing. I do that in my preaching as well. Sometimes I'll say this, I think they got it right. Then I'll say, I lost the vote on that one.
So I had Doug Moo as a professor, and he would always say that too. We'd question him about, he'd interpret something different from the NIV and be like, I lost the vote.
I love that. Yeah, that's right. We can always blame it on that.
Is it weird in your preaching or just personal Bible reading? Are there ever times where you're reading through the NIV and you come to a spot where you proposed that new interpretation there?
Yes, actually, that's happened a few times, and that's always this weird feeling, and you don't want to say it there. You don't want to say this, But yeah, that has been fun. Those few times when you say, I actually helped to make God's word clear. That's pretty
so
exciting.
neat. So exciting. So, what does your personal study time look like? Because I know you're like knee deep or like shoulder deep into just the Bible all day, but personally, how do you get fed spiritually?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll tell you, I people don't like to hear this, but I often say I really can't do my quiet time from the Bible. because I, as soon as I open it, I'm already studying. You're almost immediately studying. So it's hard to really meditate on it devotionally in that way. So I would say my quiet times are much more about reflective walks and prayer than they are about actual study. But I do find great joy in study, and so that is a quiet time in its own way.
Yeah.
And again, reading various translations as well can be really helpful in terms of that, because you see things that you hadn't really thought about. When I spend so much time in the NIV, for me to read the New Living Translation or the New Century Version or another version and you see something you hadn't noticed. You go, wait a minute, let me take a look at that. And it can really be insightful to use other translations.
Oh, for sure. Awesome.
Well, thank you, Mark, for your time and just, your candid comments here. And
excitement about the word.
Yeah, it's fun to see your energy and excitement.
Sorry,
is there anything else you'd like to add, say, comment?
No, I think it's interesting because J.B. Phillips once made the comment. He wrote a kind of a New Living Bible kind of a translation that was really popular some years ago. And he once made the comment that he felt like Bible translation was like translating the Bible was like rewiring your house, the electricity in your house with the power on. I thought that's a great description of in terms of sort of the with fear and trepidation and reverence we approach this task. And I think that sort of sums up the challenge in front of us. And so it's a great joy, but it's a great responsibility as well. So for all of us as believers to read, hear, and study God's word. So.
Amen.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Well, thank you for all your work and for your time here.
Thanks for what you guys are doing, spreading the word, getting a better Bible knowledge out there and available to people.
For sure. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Bible Toolbox. For more information and resources about the content covered in this episode, visit our website. If you have a Bible tool that you'd like us to discuss, leave a comment on our YouTube page or email us at thebibletoolbox@gmail.com.